1945, the war is over. 27 million Soviets are dead. The parades happen. The flags go up. Stalin gives a speech. Nobody calculates what comes next. The men born between 1919 and 1926, the ones who went to war at 18, 19, 20, are mostly gone. The ones who should be, in 1945, the engineers, the factory workers, the farmers, the scientists, they are on the ground in Belarus and Ukraine, and the fields outside Moscow. What remains is a country with a hole in it, not a metaphorical hole, a measurable one. In 1939, the Soviet Union had approximately 94 million working-age men. By 1946, it had approximately 63 million. 31 million men removed from the labor force, dead, disabled, or imprisoned in 6 years. 31 million. This number does not appear in the victory speeches. It appears in the labor statistics, in the factory output reports, in the agricultural production figures that show the Soviet Union struggling to feed itself through the late 1940s, not primarily because of drought or mismanagement, but because the men who should have been planting and harvesting were dead. The immediate post-war Soviet economy was a labor economy. The Soviet industrial model of the Stalin era ran on human bodies. Bodies digging coal, bodies pouring steel, bodies building the dams and railways and factories that the Soviet leadership had been constructing since the first 5-year plan in 1928. The bodies were not there. The Soviet state's response to the labor shortage was characteristic. It used what it had. Women, who had already been doing industrial and agricultural work throughout the war, continued doing it at rates that peacetime economies would not have sustained. The proportion of women in the Soviet industrial workforce in 1946 was approximately 56%. In the United States, at the same moment, it was 28%. The Soviet economy was running on female labor because the male labor had been destroyed. This worked up to a point. The Soviet reconstruction of the late 1940s was, by the measures that Soviet statistics recorded, rapid. Industrial output recovered. The cities were rebuilt. The collective farms resumed production. The nuclear program, which Stalin had prioritized above everything else after Hiroshima, proceeded on schedule and produced a Soviet atomic bomb in 1949, for years after the American won. But the speed of reconstruction concealed the structural problem that the demographic catastrophe had created. The men who were not just workers. They were the specific cohort of men who, in a normal demographic curve, would have been developing expertise through the late 1940s and early 1950s. The engineer who should have been 25 in 1946, fresh from university, beginning to learn his profession through experience. He was dead. His replacement was either a boy who was too young, or a man who was too old, or a woman who had been trained in a compressed wartime program that was not the same as the full professional education that the peacetime system would have provided. The Soviet technical and scientific establishment of the 1950s was staffed by the people who remained after the war, not by the people who would have been there if the war had not happened. The difference between those two populations is not measurable with precision, but it is real. Every technical and scientific institution in the Soviet Union was operating in the 1950s with a workforce that had a specific gap in its age distribution, a gap in the 25 to 35-year age range that corresponded exactly to the cohort that the war had destroyed. The gap had a specific economic consequence that Soviet planners understood but could not publicly acknowledge. Innovation in any technical field is disproportionately produced by people in their late 20s and early 30s. This is not a controversial finding. The mathematical physics and theoretical biology and engineering advances that drive industrial development are, in almost every historical case, the product of minds that are past the novice stage but not yet past their most energetic and creative years. The Soviet Union in the 1950s had fewer of those minds than it should have had, not because of ideology, not because of the specific failures of the Soviet educational or research system, because the men who should have occupied that position in the age distribution were dead. The atomic bomb was built. The hydrogen bomb was built. Sputnik flew in 1957. The Soviet space program was real and technically impressive, and achieved things that the American program had not yet achieved. These accomplishments are sometimes cited as evidence that the demographic catastrophe did not significantly constrain Soviet technical capacity. The citation is wrong. It proves too little. The question is not whether the Soviet Union achieved impressive technical results in the 1950s. It did. The question is what it would have achieved if the generation that should have been driving those results had not been destroyed. The counterfactual cannot be precisely calculated, but the baseline can be estimated. A Soviet Union with 30 million more working-age men, including the specific cohort of 25 to 35-year-olds who were absent from the 1950s workforce, was a Soviet Union with a significantly larger pool of technical talent, a larger agricultural labor force, a larger industrial workforce, and a demographic foundation capable of generating the next generation at a rate the actual Soviet Union could not match. The next generation is where the second wave of the demographic catastrophe hit. The men who died between 1941 and 1945 did not just remove themselves from the labor force. They removed their children from the demographic future. A man who dies at 20 does not father children. A man who fathers fewer children, because the woman he would have married cannot find a husband in a country with a men of her cohort, are dead, produces fewer children. The birth rate in the Soviet Union in the years immediately following the war reflected the demographic reality of a country with a severely distorted sex ratio. In 1946, there were approximately 60 women for every 40 men in the Soviet Union in the age groups most relevant to family formation. The imbalance was not uniform across regions. It was worse in the areas that had seen the most intense combat and the most severe wartime disruption, but it was present everywhere. The cohort of children born to the surviving population in the late 1940s was smaller than the cohort that would have been born to an undamaged demographic structure. Those children, born in the late 1940s and early 1950s, entered the Soviet labor force in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They entered a labor force that was already short of workers. They were themselves fewer in number than a normal demographic curve would have produced. And they were the parents of the cohort that would enter the labor force in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the cohort that was supposed to sustain the Soviet economy through its next phase of development. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The causes of that collapse have been analyzed by economists and historians for 3 decades, and the consensus identifies multiple factors. The structural inefficiencies of the command economy, the failure of the reform process under Gorbachev, the military spending burden of the Cold War arms race, the political illegitimacy of a system that could not accommodate the demands of a more educated and connected population. All of these factors are real. None of them fully accounts for a factor that the economic literature rarely quantifies with precision. The Soviet Union that collapsed in 1991 was demographically weaker than it should have been, across multiple dimensions, because of the chain of consequences that began with the destruction of the 1919 to 1926 male cohort between 1941 and 1945. The labor force of 1991 was smaller than it should have been. The technical workforce was less experienced than it should have been, because the generation that should have been transmitting 40 years of accumulated expertise to the next cohort had been partially destroyed before it accumulated that expertise. The population base from which the labor force was drawn was smaller than it should have been, because the demographic damage of the war had propagated through 2 generations of reduced birth rates. These are not the only reasons the Soviet Union collapsed. They are reasons that the standard analysis of the collapse consistently underweights. Professor Mark Harrison, the economic historian whose work on Soviet wartime economics is the most rigorous available, has calculated that the direct economic cost of Soviet wartime losses, measured in lost output from the men who died, represent a figure that is difficult to state precisely, but is certainly in the trillions of dollars in contemporary terms. This calculation counts only the direct output of the men who died. It does not count the output of the children they did not have. It does not count the innovations that did not happen. It does not count the expertise that was not transmitted because there was nobody to transmit it to. The full calculation, if it could be made, would be larger. How much larger is a question that economics, as currently practiced, cannot answer, Because the counterfactual, the Soviet Union that would have existed if the lost generation had lived is not a Soviet Union that exists in any archive. It exists only in the gap between what the Soviet Union was and what it might have been. The gap is visible in the demographic pyramids of the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. It is visible in the labor statistics. It is visible, if you know where to look, in the specific shape of Soviet economic development across the post-war decades. It is not visible in the victory speeches. The victory speeches talked about sacrifice and honor and the debt paid to the motherland. They did not talk about compound interest. They did not talk about the way that a demographic catastrophe does not end when the war ends but continues to compound to the decades that follow, each generation paying again for the losses of the generation that preceded it. The men of the 1923 generation did not know about compound interest in the demographic sense. They knew about the specific cold of a Russian winter and the specific noise of incoming artillery and the specific experience of being 18 years old and in a war that most of them were not going to survive. They paid what they paid. The economy paid what it paid. The accounting stretched across 50 years and ended, not coincidentally, in the decade when the last echo of their absence was still reverberating through the workforce of a country that was trying to sustain a superpower competition with a demographic foundation that the war had permanently weakened. The Soviet Union dissolves. The men born in 1923, who would have been 68 years old, retired, their children middle-aged, their grandchildren entering the workforce. Most of them never had children. Most of them never retired. Most of them are on the ground in Belarus and Ukraine, and the fields outside Moscow. The compound interest on their absence was still being paid. It was paid in full.